the Pictures episode in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. This episode occurs 2/3 of the way through the novel when the heroine Elizabeth and her aunt and uncle, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, are being given a tour of Pemberley, the magnificent house of the hero Darcy, a tour conducted by the housekeeper Mrs. Reynolds, in the course of which Mrs. Reynolds shows the visitors 2 pictures of Darcy. Throughout the episode, it's important to realise that Elizabeth is conscious of 2 crucial things from earlier in the story that those around her now are completely ignorant of. The first is that Darcy's proposal of marriage to her has given her intimate knowledge of Darcy's ardent love for her. The second is that Darcy's letter to her, written to vindicate himself against her accusations when she rejected him, has told her of Wickham's villainous attempt to seduce and elope with Darcy's 15-year-old sister. Knowledge of these things inevitably informs Elizabeth's silent but intense awareness of all that takes place in the Pictures episode. To see Darcy's pictures is to see the image of the man who loves her and whom she might have married if she had accepted his proposal. And his letter to her has prepared the ground for an appreciation of him and a total rejection of any lingering attachment she might have had to Wickham. The episode begins at the point where Elizabeth has her attention drawn firstly to 2 miniature portraits, one of Wickham and one of Darcy. I'll read the account of this moment. Her aunt now called her to look at a picture. She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham suspended amongst several other miniatures over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked her smilingly how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward and told them it was the picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late master's steward, who had been brought up by him at his own expense. "He has now gone into the army," she added, "but I'm afraid he has turned out very wild." Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. "And that," said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, "is my present master, and very like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago." "I've heard much of your master's fine person," said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. "It is a handsome face, but Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is like or not." Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this intimation of her knowing her master. "Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth coloured and said, "A little." "And do not you think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?" "Yes, very handsome." Now, the whole of what I'm calling the Pictures episode is essentially about Darcy's portraits, the second is yet to come, and the effects of these portraits on Elizabeth. But Jane Austen's initial use of Wickham's miniature provides an important point of departure. I'll return later to the housekeeper's mention of Wickham's wildness, but right now I want to note how nothing is said about Wickham's good looks, even though it's made clear earlier in the novel that he's so stunningly handsome that almost every female eye turns towards him when he enters a room. Instead, it's the handsomeness of Darcy that is now commented on, something that was briefly stated on his first appearance in the novel, but then left unremarked on until this point. The emphasis now on Darcy's physical attractiveness is, I believe, a marker of Elizabeth's developing feelings and thoughts about him. I'm not saying she's in love with him at this precise point, but that through this picture of him, and especially the next one, she's gradually learning how to see him truly, and so learning to love him. Before we reach Darcy's second portrait, there's an extended section of talk about him by Mrs. Reynolds, not about his looks, but his character. His great love for his sister is stressed, as is his excellence as a thoughtful and benevolent master. As Mrs. Reynolds says, "He is the best landlord and the best master that ever lived. There is not one of his tenants or servants but what will give him a good name." And at one point in Mrs. Reynolds' words, there's an echo of her description of Wickham in the section I read earlier, where she used the word wild to describe him. Now, and referring to her master Darcy, she says he is not like the wild young men nowadays who think of nothing but themselves. The moral contrast between the two men is clear indeed. All the time that Mrs. Reynolds is speaking about Darcy, Elizabeth is favourably re-evaluating him, a process that began some time before the Pemberley visit as a result of Darcy's long letter to her. Mrs. Reynolds' words now serve as a development of this earlier re-evaluation, and may be seen as a kind of preparation for the climax of the episode, Elizabeth's encounter with Darcy's second portrait. This second and much larger portrait is found in the main picture gallery of the house, after a climb up what is called the Great Staircase. This climb, I think, suggests Elizabeth's upwards growth towards a new point of awareness of Darcy and what he means to her. It is a kind of quest for the real Darcy, and this word quest actually appears in the passage I'm going to read next. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked on in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before they had quitted the gallery. This is a very moving moment in the novel. Consider the powerful language that is used. The picture arrests Elizabeth. It is a striking likeness of Darcy, and she stands before it in earnest contemplation. And this earnest contemplation is uninterrupted by comments from either aunt or housekeeper. Instead, Elizabeth is in silent, solitary communion with Darcy's image. Very importantly, the picture is the means of bringing out a truth about Darcy that has been semi-hidden before, namely that he has a warm smile, and that this smile has been turned directly upon Elizabeth in the past. Darcy's ability to smile has been occasionally mentioned earlier in the novel, but it has never been dwelt on because Elizabeth's prejudice against him has meant she has never appreciated it, indeed, never even properly seen it, never registered it. This picture then has the psychologically therapeutic function of recovering a memory that is vital to personal development. But the encounter with the second portrait has still more to give, as this final short extract shows. Elizabeth stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself. Consider the unusual thing that is happening here. As Elizabeth looks at the picture, she locks eyes with the figure of Darcy and makes his eyes focus on her. In other words, she animates the picture, makes it come alive by a kind of magic, the magic of deeply sympathetic, imaginative engagement. My concern in this talk is not to deal with the whole Pemberley visit, merely with what I've called the pictures episode. But I'll end by saying that 2 sentences later, once the touring party has left the great house and started to explore the grounds, Elizabeth turns back to look at the house and has the extraordinary surprise of seeing Darcy himself, who's just this moment got home a day earlier than planned. Bearing in mind her deliberate making of him come alive in the picture, I think we can take the step of viewing this as though she has conjured up the man himself, a man no longer merely on canvas, but a living, breathing human being with whom she is on the threshold of falling in love. Thank you for listening.